70 years ago, the Zionist movement committed 2 Nakbas, both of which had been in the works for decades, both of which continue unabated today. One targeted Palestinians, the other targeted Jews. The anti-Palestinian Nakba was, of course, ethnic cleansing, the wholesale theft of their country, their land, homes, farms, businesses, their art, libraries, assets, everything, even the ongoing attempts to expropriate their culture and erase memory of its origin. The Zionist anti-Jewish Nakba was, well, one might put it, the wholesale theft of Jews themselves, the theft of Jewish individual self-identity, of Jewish individual self-determination, redefining Jewry itself as the perpetrators of an ethnic supremacist settler state, and implicitly the perpetrators of the ongoing reign of terror necessary to achieve it. In the long term, the Zionist Nakba against Jews is even more insidious than that against the Palestinians, because the Palestinians have refused to be defined by their oppressors. Despite the horrors inflicted on them, the Palestinians have defied their dehumanization. They have retained their dignity, their humanity. Of course, Jews as well have refused to be defined by the Zionists. But enough have been seduced by Zionism's mass psychosis that Zionism has been able to falsely and libelously position itself as the legitimate operating identity of Jews as a people. Our governments, our media, and many of our major institutions are complicit in this crime against Jews, and in doing so have literally inverted the definition of racism against Jews, that is, anti-Semitism. But Zionism has inoculated itself against this by convincing us that it is anti-Semitic to point out Zionism's ghastly anti-Semitism. This is actually codified in the examples accompanying the so-called IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, a definition of anti-Semitism that is being pushed on governments and institutions as a universal standard for the definition. Zionism fits this definition perfectly, yet, according to the definition, it is anti-Semitic to say so. The very name of this definition is a further outrage, exploiting the memories of Hitler's victims to empower new ethnic racial crimes against humanity, because its very purpose is to silence opposition to these crimes. And so, as but one example, we now have the Labour Party in the UK smearing and expelling its most actively anti-racist members on behalf of a foreign pariah state that the British jump-started a century ago. Standing up to Zionism's injustice against Jews goes hand in hand with standing up to Zionism's injustice against the Palestinians. In my opinion, that is the way forward towards ending these 2 Nakbas and bringing justice and peace for everyone in the region. And when Zionist fronts like the Board of Deputies or the so-called Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, an Orwellian name if ever there was one, when they say that no one has the right to tell them what Jewry means, tell them that we're doing no such thing. We're simply pointing out what they've done. Some background to my reasoning. The Palestinians are, of course, the obvious victims of Zionism, but no amount of exposing the injustice against them will matter as long as the narrative that has replaced simple truth in the public discourse has reduced the Palestinians to a lesser people who are responsible for the violence on all sides. Zionism's violence against both peoples, Jews and Palestinians alike, took 2 forms: physical violence and dehumanization, that is, racism. For both peoples, the physical violence was to force mass human migration, just as Palestinians could not be removed from their land except by violence against them. Zionism could not install a critical mass of Jews in their place without violence against Jews. For the Palestinians, this was outright ethnic cleansing and massacres, as well as starving them off the land by expropriating all means of livelihood. For Jews, Zionist violence was more camouflaged. Its principal forms were the blocking of any safe haven outside of Palestine, manufactured violence to force the uprooting of Jews living elsewhere in peace, and the indoctrination of Jewish DPs, displaced people, and others refugees, and children into Zionist messianic fundamentalism. But all this, obviously, is violence against civilians to force a political goal, i.e. terrorism. That is to say, the Zionist project itself is, by its very nature, one of terrorism. There's no way around this. The only way you can force a population from its land and force another population onto it is by massive violence against civilians. Well, this is no good. Zionist leaders can't sell their project as terrorism, and so it needed to spin its terrorism as something else. It needed to spin its terrorism against the Palestinians, the obstacle to its settler state, as the opposite, as defense. To do this, it has tried to dehumanize the Palestinians into an eternal threat, irredeemably violent as a race. In truth, it has failed miserably at this, though Israel's relentless attempts to convince the world otherwise have been largely successful, especially in the all-important United States. Israel also needed extraordinary impunity. It needed to be able to operate outside the norms of civilized nations, and it has achieved near total impunity by dehumanizing Jews into the settler state itself. And I submit that this, reducing Jews as a people into this ethnic, nationalist, political invention, is the core of the entire tragic history. I also submit that exposing it is the Achilles heel to the conflict. Israel is constantly reminding us that it is the Jewish state, not a Jewish state, in the sense of a national faith that any nation might adopt. Rather, Israel's claim is something altogether different, something unique in the modern world. Israel acts as the very embodiment of Jews themselves, all Jews in a tribal sense, regardless of their nationality, regardless of their own self-identity. It expropriates Jewish history, culture, and persecution, and all they symbolize, back to the Jewish kingdoms cited in the Old Testament, of which it claims to be a rebirth, in order to support the messianic narrative that it is not a settler state. And it reinforces this by expropriating relevant archaeological artifacts as artifacts not just of an ancient Levantine kingdom, but of the modern nation-state system. We are to accept that the nation-state seated at the UN is that biblical kingdom. But 2,000 years ago, for reasons beyond its control, the pause button was pushed, and finally, in 1948, Prophet Ben-Gurion pressed play, and Israel, quote-unquote, resumed from where it left off. This messianic facade has enabled Zionism to sell itself in an allegedly post-colonial, post-conquest world. By presenting itself as interchangeable with Jews as a people, it has reduced Jews to a human shield to empower the state's crimes. Condemnation of the state then becomes condemnation of all Jews simply because they are Jews, thus making criticism of Zionism and Israel anti-Semitic by definition. But if condemnation of Israel or Zionism, if that's anti-Semitic, then what the Israeli state does is done by Jews because they are Jews, not simply by individuals who happen to be Jewish, as they might happen to be vegetarians or happen to be gay or happen to have brown eyes. So, if we accept Israel as its word, then Jews as a people are committing the nation-state's crimes. Thus, Zionism, if we accept it, succeeds where all the bigots throughout the centuries never could. Traditional anti-Semitism can only attack externally. Despite all its murders, all its horrors, all its desecration, traditional anti-Semitism is powerless to lessen the integrity of Jews or Judaism. Zionism, if we accept it, does. If we accept it, then we have corrupted Jewry itself from within. Anti-Semitism was, of course, the alleged rationale for Zionism's beginnings in the late 19th century, and although many Jews at the time saw Zionism as a betrayal of the long struggle for equality, refuge from anti-Semitism was certainly the sincere motivation of many of Zionism's early followers. But by the time of the Balfour Declaration, 101 years ago, there is no longer any ambiguity. For Zionism's leaders, the settler ethnocracy itself had already become the actual goal. Anti-Semitism and persecuted Jews had become nothing more than the means to that goal. What is irrefutable in British source documents from the time is that Balfour and the other officials involved knew in 1917, knew all along that the Zionists intended to seize all of Palestine and ethnically cleanse it. That was always the plan. It remained the plan throughout the Mandate years, and it, of course, remains the plan today. Propaganda aside, there was never any intention of living at peace and as equals with the land's native people. Behind the scenes, activists like Chaim Weizmann were demanding the entire region for a Zionist state, including Jordan, treated the ethnic cleansing of non-Jewish Palestinians as indispensable to their plans, and insisted that the British lied about the scheme until it is too late for anyone to do anything about it. In correspondence with Balfour, Weizmann, who would become Israel's first president, justified his lies with racist slurs against the Palestinians and against Jews, that is, non-Zionist Jews, and in particular the Middle East indigenous Jews who were overwhelmingly opposed to Zionism and whom Weizmann smeared with classic anti-Semitic stereotypes. The Palestinians he dismissed as, in so many words, a lower type of human. And this was among the reasons he and other Zionist leaders used for refusing simple democracy in Palestine. If the Arab, quote-unquote, if the Palestinian had the vote, he said, it would lower the Jew down to the level of a native, his word. By the 1920s, 4 decades of Palestinian protest against their dispossession of land, labor, and resources had proved futile, and the late 1920s brought the first of 2 Palestinian uprisings. Palestinian terrorists, or freedom fighters, were loosely knit groups operating outside the Palestinian villages. In contrast, Zionist terror organizations operated from within the Jewish settlements and were actively empowered and shielded by those settlements and by the Jewish Agency, the recognized semi-autonomous ruling body of the settlements, what would become the Israeli government. And whereas the Palestinian villages did help to some extent in ending Palestinian terror, the Zionist settlements were party to the terrorism, shielded and funded the terrorists, and steadfastly refused any help in stopping the terror. There were, of course, many among the Jewish settlements who were horrified at the terrorism, but if they became too vocal, they would, for example, find their cars blown up, while those who became more actively opposed were not so lucky. There were 3 major terror organizations that dominated Palestine during these years and attacked anyone in their way, Palestinian, Jew, or British. The Haganah, formed in 1920 and in large part trained by the British, was said to be a defensive militia, though by 1924 the Haganah was already assassinating Jews simply because they opposed Zionism. And the pretense that it was defensive would become unsustainable by the 1940s. Its offshoot, the Irgun, was formed in 1931 to engage in more indiscriminate terror, and the Irgun's offshoot, Lehi, better known as the Stern Gang after its first leader, was formed in 1940 by Irgun members who saw no difference between the Allied forces in the Second World War and the Axis powers, and therefore saw no reason to moderate their terror during the war. The Haganah and the Irgun toned down their terror for a while, but this was pragmatic. In late 1942, Irgun commander and future Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin judged that an Allied victory, contrary to what he had earlier thought, would not necessarily guarantee a Zionist state. And so halfway through the war, the Irgun abandoned restraint, and the Haganah would soon follow suit for equally cynical reasons, which I will explain. That Jewish children were indoctrinated and exploited was obvious at least as early as 1938, when the British caught the bomber of a bus filled with Palestinian villagers. She was 12 years old, egged on by 3 adults. Jewish teenagers, both boys and girls, were commonly used to carry out terror attacks, and this continued throughout to the ethnic cleansing of 1948. Teachers were threatened or removed if they tried to intervene in the indoctrination of their students, and the students themselves were blocked from advancement if they resisted. Jews who opposed and tried to warn of the emerging Zionist fascism were assassinated, and indeed most victims of Zionist assassination, that is a targeted individual rather than indiscriminate murder, were Jews. Palestinian armed resistance ended before the outbreak of World War II. Through to late 1947, there were virtually no Palestinian attacks as Zionist terrorists ravaged Palestine and brought the country to its knees. Palestinians maintained stoic nonviolence. A British explanation at the time for the Palestinians' refusal to respond in kind is that they understood that the attacks were a trap intended to elicit blowback that the Zionists would frame as a threat against which they would have to, quote-unquote, defend themselves. This was the tactic that the Zionist militias used to ignite the civil war of 1948 that the Jewish embassy needed, and it of course remains Israel's core strategy today: terrorize the Palestinians until there is a reaction, such as primitive rockets fired from Gaza, or occupying soldiers attacked in the West Bank, or we now know even occupying soldiers slapped in the West Bank, and then use that reaction to justify further oppression, further ethnic cleansing, further atrocities. To be treated as most secret is the red ink heading of the transcript of a key meeting of 20 people, including the top Zionist leaders, held in London on the 9th of September 1941, setting the direction for Palestine's future. It is worth summarizing from this because it is typical of what went on behind the scenes, and it is an almost comical laid bare of the lie of Zionist, now Israeli, claims of democracy and equal rights. Indeed, the conversation sounds like it anticipates George Orwell's then still-to-be-written political satire Animal Farm. Present were Weizmann, who had called the meeting, David Ben-Gurion, and other Zionist leaders such as Simon Marx of Marks and Spencer, and the prominent non-Zionist industrialist Robert Whaley Cohen. There is nothing left to the imagination. The takeover and ethnic cleansing of all of Palestine remained the plan. One of the speakers, Anthony Rothschild, began by stressing that there would be, quote, no discrimination against any group of its citizens in the proposed Jewish state. Weizmann and Ben-Gurion also assured the skeptics present Arabs, Palestinians, would have equal rights. However, they clarified that within that absolute equality, Jewish settlers would have to have special privileges. And so Weizmann's, quote, absolute equality required the ethnic cleansing of most non-Jews, while permitting, in his words, a certain percentage of Arab and other elements, whatever other elements is yet to explain, to remain in his Jewish state, the insinuation being as a pool of cheap labor. Rothschild's vision of equality and non-discrimination was equally compelling. It, quote, depended on turning an Arab majority into a minority. And to achieve this, there would be, quote, no equal rights for non-Jews. Cohen, the industrialist, found the scheme terrifying. He submitted that the Zionists were, and I quote him, starting with the kind of aims with which Hitler had started. He proposed instead that the state not be predicated on race, that it not be predicated on religion, and that it be named with a neutral geographic term. He proposed that the new state be called Palestine. The others were horrified at this idea, arguing that if the state did not have a Jewish name, quote, they would never get a Jewish majority, acknowledging the use of messianic fundamentalism as a cynical political strategy for the settler state. In another obvious but never publicly spoken admission, Ben-Gurion clarified that his Jewish state was not based on Judaism. It was rather based on being a Jew in the tribal sense, which until Zionism had been classic anti-Semitism. Weizmann further proposed taking Transjordan along with Palestine, and at the end of the meeting, he sought to put his proposals into effect officially in the name of all Jews worldwide. Those against his proposals were, in his word, you guessed it, anti-Semites. As they were discussing the occupation and ethnic cleansing of Palestine, a war was raging against occupation and ethnic cleansing, World War II. What was the Jewish Agency's reaction to the most terrible enemy Jewry, in fact, the most terrible enemy the world has ever known? From the beginning, it was not to encourage the Yishuv, the Jewish settlers, to enlist in the Allied struggle against the Nazis unless and until it was under circumstances that would further Zionism, which did not happen until the last year of the war with the so-called Jewish Brigade, an inefficient encumbrance on the Allies whose purpose was to further Zionist goals. It was to conduct a theft ring of Allied weapons and munitions, as if, as one British military record put it, as if paid by Hitler himself. It was to continue its violence in Palestine, taking resources and personnel away from the war effort. It was to run a vast program of what were euphemistically called hiking parties or walking tours, surveillance operations throughout Palestine to gather meticulous, comprehensive data about the Palestinian villages and villagers they would erase when the opportunity came. And it was to exploit the Allies' war exhaustion to force Zionist goals. Ben-Gurion had long planned to exploit the Allies' end-of-war weakness, and so by 1944, the Haganah began ratcheting up its terror. Desperate, the British mounted a public plea to the Yishuv, explaining that their terrorism was making the struggle against the Nazis all the more difficult. The plea was ignored and the terror decreased. The exploitation of the war continued after the Allied victory, when the Jewish Agency sought to exploit the fact that Britain's struggle against the Nazis had brought it to economic ruin. There was a concerted effort to pressure the United States not to approve its post-war loan to Britain unless Britain acceded to Zionist demands. Much has been written about the collaboration between the Zionists and the fascists during the war, the best known, of course, being the Havara transfer agreement that broke the anti-Nazi boycott. One of the least known was Lecky's attempted collaboration with the Italian fascists. In its proposed so-called Jerusalem Agreement of late 1940, Lecky offered to support a fascist victory in the war, in exchange for which the Italian fascists would use their military power to forcibly uproot Jewish communities and move their populations to Palestine. If this sounds like a scheme so extreme that only fanatical Lecky could have conjured it, it is essentially what the Israeli state ultimately succeeded at in the early 1950s. Most catastrophically, when it conducted a false flag terror campaign against Jews in Iraq to destroy that ancient community and move its population to Israel as ethnic fodder. Many German Jewish immigrants to Palestine during the war were outraged by the Zionist exploitation of the Nazi horrors they had just fled. This outrage was given voice by, among others, the prominent journalist Robert Welch, who had been editor of a Berlin newspaper until that paper was banned by the Nazis in 1938. Welch warned that Zionist leaders, I quote them, have not yet understood that the enemy, the Nazis, seeks the destruction of the Jews. We, who have been here only a few years, we know what Nazism is. The Zionists rather are, quote, taking part in the crash of European Jewry only as spectators. Now I paraphrase, fighting the British and keeping the Jews from joining the Allied struggle while getting comfortable and rich from their political project in Palestine. Recent immigrants from Germany and Central Europe, he said, have no representation among the Zionist movement establishment. If they did, I quote him, we would have demanded that the Yishuv should put itself at the disposal of Britain for the fight against Hitler and Nazism. But, and I am still quoting him, They, the Jewish agency, do not want to fight against Hitler because his fascist methods are also theirs. They do not want our young men to join the forces, the Allied forces. Day after day, they are sabotaging the English war effort. These German Jewish immigrants were shunned by the Zionists. Their publications and presses bombed. Even kiosks were bombed by the Zionists for selling non-Hebrew papers to German Jewish immigrants, the Hebrew language being used as a symbol of Jewish quote-unquote nationality in Palestine. In 1943, a man whom British records describe as, quote, a Jew whose integrity is not open to question, risked his life to warn about the threat of Zionism. For his safety, he was referred to only by the code name Z. Z described Zionism as a parallel movement to Nazism. He warned that the Zionist indoctrination of Jewish youth was producing a society of extremists who will use any method necessary to achieve Zionist goals. And he pointed out that as fascism in Europe has demonstrated, such a society is very difficult to undo once it has taken root. And I submit that this is what has happened. This is what we are dealing with today. How trustworthy is this anonymous testimony? Well, I found at the British National Archives a private letter in which he is identified. He was J.S. Bentwich, the senior inspector of Jewish schools in Palestine. A report by U.S. intelligence in the Middle East, dated the 4th of June, 1943, described Zionism in Palestine as a type of nationalism which in any other country would be stigmatized as retrograde Nazism, and stated that anti-Semitism was essential. Whereas, I quote the report, assimilated Jews in Europe and America are noted for being stout opponents of racialism and discrimination, Zionism has read the opposite mentality. The report refuted the Zionist propaganda about having made the desert blue. It noted the irony that it was from the Palestinians that the settlers learned, among many other things, the cultivation of the young oranges. And whereas the Palestinians were self-sufficient, the Zionist settlements exist only on massive external financing. And should the settlements ever have to survive on their own merits, as the Palestinians do, quote, the venture will collapse like a pricked balloon. The conclusion of this early U.S. intelligence report was, however, naive, or at least was premature. Now that the world, quote, has seen the level to which the Nazi creed has carried the nations, it reasoned that the Zionists, quote, are doomed to find themselves an anachronism. I'd like to say a quick word about all these Zionist-Nazi parallels. For the record, I myself do not make the parallel unless there is some historical reason for doing so. If anyone is interested in my reason for that, please ask me afterwards. In general, most countries did not open their doors to the survivors of World War II as they should have, the United States among them. And this is cited as a principal reason why Zionists sought to increase Jewish immigration in Palestine. But this is a ruse. Most Zionist leaders did not want Jews to have any option but Palestine and thwarted safe haven elsewhere. The settler project needed them as facts. As but one example of one of the better documented examples, in early 1944, President Roosevelt succeeded in principle in establishing 500,000 new homes for European DPs, more than half of these homes in the United States and Britain. U.S. Zionist leaders were outraged and sabotaged. When Roosevelt's aide, Morris Ernst, confronted U.S. Zionist leaders in an attempt to save the program, he was, in his words, I quote him, thrown out of parlors and accused of treason. Treason because Morris Ernst was Jewish and the Zionists owned Jews. As Ernst bitterly put it, the offer of new homes in the United States endangered what he called the Zionist pet thesis, that Jews must go only to Palestine. Nor were those already settled safe. In 1946, the Ashkenazi chief rabbi of Palestine, Yitzhak Herzog, went
to Europe to forcibly remove orphans of Jewish background from their adopted European families. Removing 10,000 children from their homes was the number he freely cited to the New York Times as his goal. In the British National Archives, I found a copy of his record of the trip. In it, Herzog complains of the fierce resistance that he met from horrified local Jewish leaders who tried to protect the children, but he used his political clout to circumvent them. In France, as one example, in France, facing the steadfast refusal of the local Jewish leaders to betray the children, Herzog said, "I demanded promulgation of a law which would oblige every family to declare the particulars of the children in houses." Now I paraphrase, so that those of Jewish background could be exposed and put back in camps awaiting shipment to Palestine. To me, this is a Kafkaesque twist on Passover for these children who had just been spared the Nazis. Herzog's justification for the kidnappings was that for a child of Jewish background to be raised in a non-Jewish home is, quote, much worse than physical murder. Yet even this bizarre justification fails to explain what was actually happening, because at the same time, Herzog was rescuing children from this fate, much worse than physical murder. His Jewish agency colleagues were sabotaging Jewish adoptive homes in England for young survivors still in the camps. The real reason for it, of course, was that the children were needed to serve Zionism as facts on the ground. To that end, the Jewish Agency had coerced President Truman to segregate Jewish DPs into Zionist-run camps, despite objections that it echoed Nazi behavior. The camps nurtured such fanaticism that it shocked a joint U.S.-UK committee that visited them in 1946. Before these camps, the evidence is that few Jewish DPs wanted to go to Palestine. But now the committee found these DPs in a literally a delirious state, threatening mass suicide if they did not go to Palestine. Even the offer of new homes in the United States, which was made and which had always been the favored destination, was now suddenly met with threats of mass suicide. DPs were also groomed in these camps to bring Zionist terrorism to Europe, bombing Allied trains and Allied facilities. The bombing of the British Embassy in Rome in 1946, for example, was aided by DPs brainwashed in Zionist camps, as was a near catastrophe in the Austrian Alps in the summer of 1947, when DPs nearly blew an Allied train off a steep trestle into a deep abyss, which would certainly have sent its 200 civilians and Allied troops to their deaths. Behind closed doors, the Jewish Agency discussed its obstacles, and what it considered obstacles in the 1940s says quite a lot about the present. These were democracy, the Atlantic Charter, which of course became the basis for the United Nations, Reconstruction was a source of worry, and the fall in anti-Semitism, anti-Semitism having always been Zionism's drug, without which it would be irrelevant. As an example, in Jerusalem, in October of 1942, Ben-Gurion told Jewish agency leaders that although Hitler had made Jews suffer, he also, quote, revived in assimilated Jews the feeling of Jewish nationalism. And we have exploited this feeling in favor of Zionism. But democracy remained a threat. He warned that Zionism was losing favor because the democracies, quote, recognized the Jews as people having full rights of citizenship and blamed setbacks on Zionism, setbacks for Zionism on what he called America's quote-unquote democratic attitude. Another agency official agreed, condemning the democratic countries and their Atlantic Charter as enemies of Jewry. I also mentioned post-war Reconstruction. To paraphrase from a British report, Zionist leaders were afraid that with the improvement of conditions in Europe, the pressure on Palestine would subside. By 1946, Zionist terrorism had become the defining daily challenge of life in Palestine, and 100,000 British troops proved unable to contain it. Anything or anyone that kept Palestine a functioning society was a target of the Zionists. Trains, roads, bridges, communications, oil facilities, and Coast Guard stations were constantly being bombed. Soldiers, utility workers, telephone repairmen, railway workers, bomb disposal personnel were murdered. Police, and especially Jewish police, were long a favored target of the Zionists and were gunned down by the dozens. Among the smaller terror organizations that popped up around this time was one specifically dedicated to the Zionist long-running fear of Jews befriending non-Jews, the ultimate fear, of course, being polluting what for the Zionists was the pure Jewish race. As a sample of its methods, the terror group doused a disobedient Jewish girl with acid, blinding her in one eye. Zionist terror was aided by an intelligence network that included high-placed sympathetic U.S. officials, such that the British learned not to trust even direct messages to U.S. President Truman. When the UN's Palestine Committee, UNSCOM, visited Palestine in the summer of 1947, the agency had already replaced the committee members' drivers with spies, had replaced the waiters at the main restaurant they frequented with spies, and most productively, sent 5 young women to serve at what they called a theater network of house attendants at the building where the UNSCOM committee, all of them men, were being housed. The young women were required to be smart and educated, but above all, in the agency's word, the young women were required to be daring. Whatever daring meant, they extracted a wealth of information from the key people who were about to decide Palestine's future. Jewish sex workers were involuntarily recruited as spies. They were told that upon the Zionist victory, which they were assured was imminent, they would be executed for cavorting with the enemy, but might be spared if they cooperated as spies now. The practice was so widespread that a standard questionnaire was printed up that the women were to fill out after each British customer. Illustrative of the degree to which Zionist plans infiltrated the government and everyday life, a couple of months after one Coast Guard station was attacked and bombed by the Haganah, it blew up again, but this time the British were baffled because this time there had been no attack, it just blew up. They discovered that the construction crew that had rebuilt it after the previous attack were Haganah and had simply embedded explosives in the reconstruction. But the worst problem of infiltration was in the military service, where deadly sabotage by Zionist plans who had joined the forces led, tragically, to orders to remove all Jews from service in Palestine because there was no way to tell them from the Zionists. By 1948, this problem spread to key medical personnel. After the Jewish agency poisoned the water supply of Akka with typhoid in order to expedite the ethnic cleansing of the city that, of course, lies on the Palestinian side of partition, the bacteriologist hired by the British proved to be a Haganah plant or sympathizer, an obstacle to the availability of the vaccine. The Exodus, as one example of violence against Jews, the Exodus, the iconic Zionist immigrant story, was timed for UNSCOM's visit to Palestine in the summer of 47. The British, posterity has it, sent the Exodus passengers back to their worst nightmare, Germany, destroying their last hope of a new life in their promised land. The reality, however, is that this was all grand theater, cynical marketing for the Zionist cause at the expense of Jewish survivors. Yet again, the Jewish agency blocked opportunities of freedom and new lives for the survivors, in this case, to manufacture sympathy victims. The possibility of new homes for the Exodus passengers in safe countries like Denmark was blocked by Ben-Gurion. The option of disembarking in southern France instead of returning to Germany, which all the Exodus passengers had, was blocked by the Jewish agency. In fact, the British confronted Golda Meir, whose name was then Meyerson, They confronted her about this abuse of the Jewish refugees, but she refused to budge. The Exodus passengers would go back to Germany. To paraphrase Israeli professor Edith Zertal, the greater the suffering of these survivors of the Holocaust, the greater their political and media effectiveness for the Zionists. And bear in mind that the entire human cargo of the Exodus, 4,515 people, was less than 1% of President Roosevelt's resettlement plan that the Zionists had sabotaged 3 years earlier. A few months after the Exodus, in November 1947, the UN, violating its own charter, blocked Palestinian self-determination and recommended partition with the implicit creation of a Zionist state. Resolution 181 and the creation of the Israeli state was the direct capitulation to Zionist terrorism, the surrender to the certainty of that continuing terror against the West. Caving to that terrorism left the Palestinians as the sole victims of that continuing terrorism. The alternate UN plan was for a binational state, which the British believed the Palestinians would have reluctantly supported as a compromise to their desire and absolute rights for a democratic state. But this compromise would be, to quote British documents, totally unacceptable to the Zionists, and, quote, would therefore be followed by an intensification of Jewish terrorism. That is, yet greater Zionist terrorism over that which had already brought Palestine to its knees. The disproportionately large land area that the UN gave the Zionists was also in fear of Zionist terrorism. Again, quoting British sources, giving the Zionists so much land up front was an attempt to delay, not prevent, but simply delay the Zionist expansionist wars that they knew would come. This appeasement, of course, failed, though, because within a few months of Resolution 181, the Zionist militias were already waging their first expansionist war, confiscating more than half of the Palestinian side of partition, and massacring and depopulating hundreds of villages. This so-called War of Independence was, in truth, to quote the British High Commissioner at the time, operations based on the mortaring of terrified women and children. Its broadcast, boasting of their successes, quote, both in content and in manner of delivery, are remarkable, like those of Nazi Germany. The Zionists were, quote, jubilant with their campaign of calculated aggression coupled with brutality. British intelligence reported that the Zionists, quote, persecution of Christian Jews, by which I assume they mean converts, and Jews who offend against national discipline, that is, Jews who are insufficiently Zionist, has reached, I quote, medieval standards. But the fact that the British were occupying Palestine enabled Zionist leaders to juxtapose their terror campaign as a liberation movement against British colonizers. Finally, on the 15th of May, 1948, before there was any Arab resistance, Britain fled the scene of its crime, for which the Palestinians have been paying ever since. British and U.S. documents prove that both governments knew all along that the Zionist acceptance of Resolution 181 was a fraud. The Americans knew it, the British knew it, and most of all, the Palestinians knew it. And this, not just the Palestinian refusal to forfeit their right to self-determination, was why their negotiators could not agree to Resolution 181. The armistice that ended the 48 war established a ceasefire line that, to quote from it, is not to be construed in any sense as a political or territorial boundary. Israel was supposed to return to the agreed partition or some other mutually agreed alternative, but it simply refused. Even if one accepts the legality of partition, which I don't, but even if one accepts it, the Israeli occupation of Palestinian land began in 1948, not in 1967. We have today the sense that the situation calmed after 1948. This is completely false. The ethnic cleansing and now across almost this line, terrorism continued. Israel now holding up the untenable catastrophe it had created and refused to rectify as the threat against which it now had to defend itself. Indeed, Zionist terrorism increased. What changed pre-statehood versus post-statehood is that the victims of Zionist terror no longer included Europeans. Israel's 1967 conquest and its ethnic cleansing of 300,000 more non-Jews heightened its need for ever more settlers. And so when in the 1980s, Jews were able to leave Russia and emigrate to the United States, Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir, former bigwig of the terror gang Lehi, successfully coerced U.S. President Reagan to close U.S. doors to them. It is to assert this implicit ownership over all Jewry, regardless of their nationality, regardless of their own self-determination, that Israel refuses to allow Israeli nationality. By Israeli law, the nationality of Jewish children of Israel is Jewish, and repeated legal challenges to this abuse of Jews have all failed. Any acknowledgement that a Jewish individual might be free of an intrinsic connection to Israel would undermine its pretense, its messianic pretense, as the obligatory common destiny of Jews because they're Jews. Nationalism and Jews were made one and the same in the service of Zionism. It is consummate irony, then, that Zionism is now being flaunted as Jewish self-determination. I'm sure we've all heard this. Jewish self-determination. It is exactly the opposite. It is the hijacking of Jewish individual self-identity and self-determination. The conflict, quote-unquote conflict, which is, of course, not a conflict in any true sense of the word, could end tomorrow if our own governments wanted it to end. And if this claim sounds exaggerated, I ask you to imagine for a moment how the international community would react if the situation were precisely as it is, but with the ethnicities reversed. If the ethnicities were reversed, the international community would rush their militaries to the region to stop what it now empowers and finances. And the international community would jump to proclaim that equality obviously means the unqualified right of return. It would suddenly be self-evident that you can't ethnically cleanse people and then say that equality does not apply to them because they're not here. That would be a grotesque parody, and it has been a grotesque parody of justice for 70 years. We must do what Edwin Montagu, Jewish member of the British government a century ago, did. We must accuse our governments, the British government, the United States government, most of the EU, of anti-Semitism for colluding with the Zionists. We must fight this as a dual battle. By fighting it as a single struggle for Palestinian liberation, we are allowing the Zionists to control that struggle. By fighting it as the dual struggle that it is, we take back control. We pull the rug out from under their all-important mythical narrative and replace it with the truth. Thank you.